Hi everyone, my name is Schmidt and I'm the founder and principal of Schema, a design and technology firm based in Seattle. And I'm really excited to be here today. I wanted to talk about a topic that I've thought about a lot this year, which is the topic of polarization. The polarization we see here in the US and all over the world. And I want to talk about how design can be a catalyst for sparking conversation. 2020 was a truly groundbreaking year. First, we had the global pandemic, then police violence and protests all around the world, and most recently, the fires in California and up the West Coast to Oregon and Washington State. It's hard to imagine how 2020 could have been any more disruptive. And these events all had one thing in common. They were highly politicized. Depending on what side of the political spectrum you were on, you would hear a very different story. And nowhere was this as clear as in the Black Lives Matter protests. They were either peaceful protests of citizens just exercising their right to free speech and standing up for social justice, or they were violent riots filled with looting and destruction. And of course, in reality, they were a little bit of both. I experienced this firsthand over the summer in Seattle. Our office is in the middle of what was known as the CHOP, the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest. And so on my way to and from work, I would get to see the disparity between what was happening on the ground and the way that it was portrayed in the media. And the truth was actually somewhere in the middle. It was more nuanced than it was being portrayed. So why is this happening? Why is this happening in an era where we have access to more information than ever before in human history? Well, I think the problem is that information comes to us in the form of sensationalist headlines and content that is vying for our attention. And this is content that is often designed to provoke an emotional response, to get us worked up. And this is known as the attention economy, where we are fed ever smaller bites of information to grab our attention. And this is information that caters to our shorter and shorter attention spans, and that also doesn't challenge any of our existing beliefs. And the result of all this is that trust in the news media and in journalism has plummeted to an all-time low. This is from a recent study by Gallup and the Knight Foundation conducted just earlier this year. And they found that 84% of Americans think that the news media is critical for democracy. A majority says that fair and accurate news reports are important to ensure that the public remain informed and also that our leaders are held accountable for their actions. So that's good. But at the same time, 86% believe that news coverage is politically biased, and a large majority sees that as a huge problem. Even worse, most think that inaccurate news is intentional. So fake news is intentional. And 80% say that the news media that they distrust, so the other side, is trying to persuade people to adopt a certain viewpoint. And by the way, this is not only happening in the US. The distrust in the news is really a global phenomenon. These are numbers for countries around the world on trust in the media, and it's a pretty dismal picture. South Korea and France rank lowest at 23 and 21%, which is actually not far below the US and the UK. And because of our distrust in the media, many of us then decide to tune out and rely on one, maybe two trusted news sources. And increasingly, we also get our news from friends on social media. The result is that we're segmenting ourselves into smaller and smaller groups, into tribes, and this is making it more difficult to find common ground and to work together. Here is a visualization by researchers at NYU that shows the political polarization of Twitter users. The nodes are users who sent political messages, and the lines are retweets. The colors show users with either liberal or conservative viewpoints, the blue or the red. And so what you can see by looking at this visualization is that political messages spread more among the in-groups, so they spread more among connections that share the same political views. And so this is really evidence that many of us are caught in filter bubbles of our own making. And I think the question is, how can we activate the middle so that we can have conversations again that go beyond the borders of our tribes, that go beyond our filter bubbles? And with every year that goes by, there is then growing disagreement on big, important issues that we all face. These are the key issues in the US election, from climate change to gun control, healthcare, the economy, the coronavirus outbreak. And I think you'd all agree that these are highly complex issues. And if we're honest with ourselves, how much do we really understand about these issues? Yet at the same time, they are highly politicized. And so it seems that we don't have the full picture, that we are simply not in control. We don't understand these issues in their entirety, and we are not in control of where we're headed. It's no wonder then that many of us feel a deep sense of anxiety. Richard Saul Wurman was the founder of the TED conference, and he called this information anxiety. He writes, "Information anxiety is the black hole between data and knowledge, and it happens when information doesn't tell us what we want or need to know." Well, we are currently right there in that black hole. And so, in this polarized world, how can we possibly move forward? How can we dig ourselves out of that hole and attempt to solve the big divisive issues that we face if we can't come together? When I think back to my high school education in Germany in the early 90s, I remember a culture of dialogue and discussion. Whether it was politics, economics, social issues, nothing really seemed off limits, no matter what side you were on. It was still possible to have a civil conversation. This was, of course, over 30 years ago, and since then the world has changed a lot, but I've also always held a strong belief in the power of conversation. And I think even more so today than ever before, conversation is important. And it's maybe even the only thing that can heal this extreme polarization that we have. It's the only way we can hope to find common ground. And to have a dispassionate, productive conversation, we have to start from a position of agreement. Right? If we disagree with each other from the get-go, it's impossible to come together. So we need the ability to unwind an issue back to its fundamentals, back to the facts, the data. Maybe then we would have some territory that we could all agree on. So I think we have to make the attempt to understand any issue, any topic, objectively by understanding the underlying data. Let's take a closer look at issues in the news. So here I'm using the example of the European migrant crisis from a few years back, which of course was an issue with global impact. And so issues like this, they present themselves over time, usually as a series of events that unfold, often over a course of a few years. And so these events are accompanied by stories, the stories that we hear in the news, day in, day out. And so every issue then can really be seen in a way as a series of data points. But in the news and in social media, we usually only get to see specific data points that are used to support an opinion or a perspective. We very rarely get to see the whole picture. But what if we could? What if we could actually step back and see an issue holistically? Having access to all of the data would make it possible. It would also make it possible to reveal the connections that go beyond the headlines and the chatter on social media. And we could use the data to understand an issue from all sides, giving us a 360-degree view of an issue. And I think that data visualization can help with that. It can help by presenting a comprehensive view of an issue, that 360-degree view. And by doing so, it can facilitate conversation through a fair and accurate representation of the facts. And that's what Schema aims to do. We aim to use design and data visualization to create digital experiences that spark conversation. But what do these interfaces look like? Well, I think that these experiences, these interfaces, need to be inclusive. They have to cater to a diverse and global audience. They have to make people feel empowered as opposed to feeling overwhelmed by looking at the data. And they have to make it so non-experts can also understand the data. So I think they have to be universal. These have to be universal interfaces. And to build these interfaces, we can learn from our physical experiences as humans. At a very fundamental level, we can use the embodied experience, which is the relationship of our bodies to the world around us. We can use that as a way to design these interfaces, because that is what we all have in common. So we can design interfaces using universal metaphors that are based on our shared experience of the physical world. Take, for example, our experience exploring a city. We have maps that help orient ourselves. They can help us understand a city's structure and organization. And then when we're down on the street, we can explore freely. We can walk around, explore all the nooks and crannies, the neighborhoods of a city, just like a tourist. And I think we need to be able to explore digital information spaces the same way, at these different scales, the macro and the micro. And that way we can hope to see connections between the parts and the whole. In 2007, I was lucky to work on a project that I still think was truly groundbreaking, the user interface for the One Laptop Per Child. This was a laptop for children in developing countries. And for us, as the designers of the user interface, the big idea was to create a universal experience, a universal interface that would be intuitive for children all over the world from vastly different cultures. And so instead of a conventional desktop metaphor with files and folders, we challenged ourselves to design an interface based on a spatial metaphor, linking people and activities. And so you basically go through three spaces: a private space, a space for your friends and for collaboration, and then finally a space for connecting with people around you. You move through these three spaces when you're interacting with the interface. And so One Laptop Per Child, for me, was a kind of inflection point in thinking about the power of universal interfaces. And so in summary, I think that the affordances of data visualization interfaces, that they are based on three principles: context, control, and connection. Context is about seeing the big picture, while control is about seeing patterns and insights in the data. And connection in the middle becomes possible because of the other two layers, and it's ultimately about seeing patterns and insights in the data. An early project of mine that builds on the idea of data visualization as interface is called Invisible Cities. And in many ways, this project has served as a template for the projects that we do at Schema. So Invisible Cities reveals the social networks in the urban landscape. And it does that by displaying geocoded activity from Twitter in real time on a three-dimensional map of the city. So here you're looking at New York. You can see Manhattan in the middle, surrounded by the other boroughs. And you can see the white dots that appear. Those are the tweets that stream in real time. And as the data streams in, it causes the underlying landscape to change. So it creates hills and valleys over time that represent areas of high and low density of social data. Clicking on a tweet will, of course, let you see its contents, but it also creates connections to other tweets, which are represented here by the lines that you can see. And these connections are also summarized in the topics that you can see on the right-hand side. And these change throughout the course of the day. So we created visualizations for not just New York, but various cities around the world. Here you're looking at downtown Tokyo, for example. And in the end, Invisible Cities is an experimental visualization that makes social data visible and discoverable, as if it was a physical landscape. It combines the on-the-ground personal perspective with a bird's eye view for contextualizing information and seeing connections. These next two case studies then are more recent projects by Schema that I believe can really help facilitate conversation around current issues. The first is Legislative Explorer, which is an ongoing collaboration with the Center for American Politics and Public Policy at the University of Washington. And it's a series of interactive data visualizations that show patterns of lawmaking in government, both local and national government. This is our latest visualization, which was just released earlier this year, and it shows the big picture of lawmaking at a local level for Washington State. It shows all the bills and resolutions and their process from introduction to becoming law. So you can play back each 2-year session of Congress and see how the bills flow through the process. The bills, of course, are the dots that you see here, colored blue for Democrat-sponsored bills and red for Republican bills. And at any point you can hover over these bills to see their titles. You can click on them as well to see their contents. And you can also hover on the sponsors, who are there on the left-hand side in the Senate and the House. And you can see the bills that they have introduced and the paths that their bills took. And you can also filter the data in various ways. So you can filter by party, looking at Democrat-sponsored bills, comparing that to Republican-sponsored bills. You can filter by gender, if you want to see the gender breakdown, looking at male-sponsored bills versus female-sponsored bills. And you can also filter on topic. So this would be looking at all education bills, for example, comparing that to all environment bills. And you can also then zoom in to look at the bills more closely. You can see the information on the right-hand side for the bills. You can also click on a link to go to the source if you want to read the actual contents of the bill. So Legislative Explorer is all about making what happens in Congress feel tangible and transparent. And it lets us see the inner workings of government and understand what bills might have an impact and effect on our lives, which is especially true for local government here in the US. And so being able to see the information this way helps us understand our government a little bit better, and it also helps us understand what issues and topics and bills our elected officials are supporting. So the next case study then is Searching COVID-19, which is also very topical. And this was a response to the pandemic that we launched earlier this year, back in June. It was a collaboration with the Google News Initiative and the news group Axios. And so this project shows the waves of the pandemic based on what people were searching for on Google relative to COVID-19. And so it starts with a timeline, and you can see here that it starts around January, with the first reported US case in January 20th. Then we had February 29th, the first reported US death. And the bubbles that you see here are the search queries over time, the aggregated search queries. And one thing you can see right off the bat is how the volume of search queries increased after the first reported death in the US. Then as you continue to scroll down, you can see a breakdown of the relevant search queries beginning with what is compared to those beginning with how to. And so with the what is queries, we were interested in understanding what people were searching on around understanding what COVID-19 was. So what is the coronavirus and what are the symptoms are examples of what is queries. And so those tended to happen much earlier on in the spread of the pandemic, while the how-to queries happened later on, as people were understanding how to deal with the situation. So examples include how to prepare for the coronavirus, how to make face masks, or how to make hand sanitizer. And as we looked at the data, we were interested in how the ratio between the what is and the how-to queries changed over time, and if it also corresponded to milestones that occurred in the spread of the pandemic. And the answer is yes, there was definitely a correspondence to milestones like the CDC recommending face masks at the beginning of April. And internationally, you could see similar patterns as well. We looked at English-speaking countries around the world where we could adopt the same methodology. And so here we can see that the ratio of what is to how-to queries also changed in a similar way over time, with the what is queries being more predominant at the beginning of the pandemic and the how-to queries becoming more predominant throughout. We then attempted a more granular categorization of the data to see if we would see any trends. So we categorized queries by general knowledge, symptoms and treatments, preparedness, economic impact, government response, and gathering remotely. And again, it's possible to see a time shift, a kind of time-shifted concentration of these categories. So for example, the general knowledge, symptoms, and preparedness were more popular in the beginning, while economic impact, government response, and gathering remotely became much more popular later on as the pandemic continued to spread. This is also true internationally, where we again looked at queries comparing the economic impact versus general knowledge. And you can again see a very distinct trend from general knowledge in the beginning to economic impact later on in the progression of the pandemic. And then the final scene lets you find your own insights and stories in the data. So you can split the data by what is versus how-to queries or by query category. You can also color by both of those facets as well. And you can hover on individual data points to see the specific queries. So in the end, searching COVID-19 is a bottom-up way of understanding the spread of the pandemic based on what people are searching for. And we can see where a country is in the spread of COVID-19, but I also think that it might make it possible to anticipate future waves as well through kind of a grassroots way of understanding where we are in the pandemic overall based on what people are searching for. So in the end, I'm hopeful that creating more opportunities like these to engage with the data, with the facts underlying the issues, that will make it possible for us to have civil conversations again. And I believe that data visualization as interface can create a more inclusive alternative to the forces dividing us, to the forces that are pulling us apart, and that it can give us a possible way forward. Thanks so much.